Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about appeals to authority. In the next few lectures, I want to talk about how do we provide good premises for our arguments, how do we especially support premises that aren't obviously true. If we're going to use controversial premises, that is, premises that, you know, we think there's some chance the average person will reject or won't accept, how do we justify them? Now, that could be a whole course in itself. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because, logic is more about the form of an argument than a content, but I do think we should say something. And so, one way we can justify controversial premises is by appealing to authority. Um, but some people will say, I think very sloppily, that appeal to authority is a bad form of argument. I think they have something specific in mind, but nonetheless, we have to be very cautious about appeals to authority. Done well, done properly, appeals to authority are a good way to support many claims that might not be obviously true at first glance, right? But appeals to authority can be done very badly, and people often do them very badly. In that case, they're used to give us reason to accept claims that we really shouldn't. So I want to say a bit about appeals to authority, then we'll talk about when they're justified, when they're not. So look, let's just take a moment to appreciate why appealing to authority is so important. I say we can use this to support premises that might not be obviously true, but the truth of the matter is we appeal to authority all the time for all kinds of claims about what we know to be true or not. Let me just give you guys a list. If you travel faster, time slows down. As you get close to the speed of light, it slows down quite a lot. This is one of those sci-fi things, physicists swear to me that it's true. It is almost certainly within Biden's legal authority to impose vaccine mandates for workplaces. Better ventilation could prevent many cases of both COVID and the flu. The death penalty is not a more effective deterrent than alternatives. Rote memorization is a really ineffective way to learn anything. When it comes to losing weight, diet is much more important than exercise. And finally, a nuclear war would likely destroy most life on Earth due to the damage it would do to the climate, to the environment. Now look, as a matter of fact, I think all these claims happen to be true. It doesn't matter whether you think they're true or false. My point is, if you wanted to show that these are true, or on the other side, if you think I'm just completely wrong, if you want to show they're false, how would you do it? One could try to examine the evidence directly, right? But that might be difficult or impossible, right? I mean, think about one here. This is based on Einstein's theory of relativity. Einstein's theory of relativity is very, very complicated. Um, it involves a lot of math that very few people understand. You need to have high level math skills to understand this theory and why stuff behaves this way. I don't have that level of math skills. Even the people I know who do have this level of math skills say, like, the relativity, the math, the equations are really, well, hard, right? Not fun to deal with. Or two, I'm not a lawyer, right? You know, if you say, well, you're wrong, it's not within his authority to do this, well, you're not a lawyer either, probably, right? Why do we think this? Why do we make these claims about the law, right? Go on down the list. A lot of these require expertise that very few of us are going to have, right? So, how would we support these claims? Or if you don't like them, how might you try to show that they're false? Background, especially for something like one, but even all of these, right? Even three, right? What do I know about epidemiology or ventilation in a building, right? What do I know about the death penalty and whether it's an effective deterrent? right? I'm not a criminologist. I haven't studied these things. How can I make any claims about this? I don't know labor law well enough to evaluate the evidence for 2. My math isn't up to evaluating 1. I don't know engineering and epidemiology well enough to evaluate 3. And so on, right? For all of these claims, unless, if you really have a lot of background, maybe you know enough to really support one on your own, right? I've been teaching a long time. I think I know pretty well, 5. I would back that up in my own expertise. It really isn't a great way to learn anything. But the other 6, I think we're going to have to rely on experts. We just simply have to trust experts who tell us, hey, even though you can't do the math, trust me, time does this weird, weird thing. They've tested this, it actually does. They put there used to be this supersonic jet, the Concorde. They put a clock on it. It flew across the sea after a year. The clock was actually some tiny fraction of a second slower. Anyway, we simply have to trust the experts on many claims. Well, and it's often a legitimate way to justify a premise, but sometimes an appeal to authority is a bad way to argue, right? Smart people can and do believe stupid and awful stuff. And, beyond all that, there's just something a little disturbing about having to take the word of somebody else on an important thing. I think it's unavoidable, but it is kind of troubling, right? The main thing we want to avoid, though, is, believing something stupid and awful because some idiot who claims to be an expert believes it, or, quite possibly, believing something stupid and awful because a very smart person who just happens to be wrong believes it, right? So the first thing I think we should think about is that there are 3 conditions for a legitimate appeal to authority. There must be recognized authorities on this particular subject and agreement about who those authorities are. Look, not complete and perfect agreement, but a pretty high degree, right? There's always going to be some idiot who, doesn't think that doctors are experts on medicine, but, some rando he sees on YouTube is. Most of us know that's crazy. We wouldn't trust rando on YouTube if we thought we had cancer or something, right? Most of us know that doctors or authorities on medicine, we admit that. 2, the person you appeal to must be one of those authorities. You don't get anywhere arguing about medicine if you appeal to a doctor whose doctorate is in art history, right? Or philosophy. And there must be a large degree of agreement among those authorities on this particular issue. Let me give you guys an example, right? Let's take doctors, right? You will not find, I doubt you'll find any doctor who thinks that smoking isn't bad for you, right? There's almost unanimous agreement among doctors that smoking is not a good idea. I've known doctors who smoked, but they would all say, yeah, this is terrible. I don't know why I do this. I wish I could quit. This is stupid, right? You're not going to find a doctor in modern times, maybe you'd find one in the 1950s who said, yes, smoking is good. It stimulates your T-zone, which is important for health, right? Actually, what all smoking as your T-zone was like, I think your nose and your mouth. I don't know. Anyway, doctors agree smoking is bad for you, right? But doctors might not agree on other stuff, right? There's a lot of controversy on a lot of treatments. That's the reason people get second opinions, right? lots of different treatments. There's not 100% agreement. Um, one that comes to mind, doctors don't really agree completely about how effective, say, statins are for preventing heart attacks. Statins are these drugs that lower your cholesterol. Some debate among doctors, well, maybe they prevent heart attacks. For most people, maybe they don't, right? So, more disagreement there, much less justifiable to appeal to that than it is to appeal like, well, why do you think smoking is bad? Well, doctors say it's bad, right? Well, anyway, how do you know someone is an authority? I've been talking about doctors because they're an easy case, right? How do you know someone is an authority on medicine? Well, they have a degree, they have a license, right? This goes for doctors, this goes for nurses, this goes for radiology techs. There is a licensure, there is recognition, right? The same for a lot of other fields, right? CPAs, attorneys, architects, right? You know, we all know who the accountant is. Why? If you want to know whether something is a legitimate tax write-off or a good idea, or if it'll send you to jail, you ask your accountant. You know who a good accountant is because he will have his certification and his degree on the wall, right? But this isn't always the case, right? There's not always this complete recognition and licensure, right? Especially when you get into more specialized issues, right? Not every doctor is going to be an expert about COVID, right? Not every attorney is going to be an expert on criminal law, right? If you talk to your friend who only ever does civil cases, that is people suing each other over money, about a criminal case, that might not be so reliable, right? And what about other fields where, there's no licensure, right? You might want to make a claim in economics, but, there are economists, but there's no licensed economics license that allows you to pronounce on what taxes should be or whatever, right? So how do you know who is and isn't an expert when there's not this neat licensure and recognition? I think there's 3 common criteria. Education, position, achievement, right? You want to talk about economics, you want to talk about business, you're going to be a lot better off if you look to somebody who has a PhD than if you look to somebody who has a bachelor's, right? More education, generally speaking, the more relevant education in the field, the better, right? Take another case. There's no physics license, somebody who is licensed to tell us about what time does at really high speeds or the weird stuff particles do and all that, right? But, people have degrees in physics. And the more of an education they have, the guy who has a PhD in physics, better reason to think he's an expert than somebody who just has a bachelor's. Better reason with both to think than somebody who just took a class or two but doesn't have a degree in it, right? Position, somebody is, say, a university professor in physics or economics, better reason to trust their claims than if they're just a random guy, right? Achievement, right? If these are the guys who are writing the textbooks, in physics or economics or whatever, or on epidemiology, then there's a good reason to think that they know what they're doing, right? Or if they get appointed to a very high office. That one's a little fallible. Sometimes, that's political, whatever. But generally speaking, it's not a bad indicator, especially when taken with some other stuff. So then the question is, how do you know if experts agree? I mean, sometimes it's obvious, right? Doctors obviously agree that smoking ain't great for you, right? But other times you're going to have to do a little research, right? You know, one thing people do with appeals to authority that is just really terrible is they'll cherry pick one claim that agrees with what they believe and won't bother to see if there really is agreement in the field. You know, be it economics, be it physics, be it criminology, if it's a controversial claim, if you don't already know something about the field, do some research, see if different people agree. You know, in general, and I'll talk a lot more about this next lecture, in general, using multiple sources to back up any controversial claim is a good idea. But when you're talking about experts, you know, find several experts, see if they all agree on this claim. That's better than if you just go with one person, right? More sources better. And in a lot of fields, even if there's a lot of debate, you will find that there will be agreement. Now look, there's 3 common mistakes with appeals to authority that you want to avoid. One is to take the word of someone who is an expert in one area, but not the one in question. 2 is to cherry pick, the view of an legitimate expert in the field, but he has a fringe opinion that's at odds with the consensus in the field. 3, similar but not as bad, cherry pick an expert or experts who agree with you when there's actually no agreement, when there's a lot of controversy in the field. Let me give you guys some examples of one. Einstein said, you cannot simultaneously prepare for war and keep the peace. I'm not even sure Einstein said this, right? I feel like, Einstein and Confucius get all sorts of dumb stuff attributed to them because dumb stuff sounds like clever once you put Einstein or Confucius's name on it, right? I'm not sure he said this about war and peace. I think it's actually kind of stupid. I hope he didn't say it. I don't know, that's just my opinion. I'm not an expert on this either, so take that with all the salt you want to. But even if Einstein said this, right? Who cares? I mean, Einstein's a physicist. He's not a diplomat. He's not a general. He's not a, president. Why think he knows how to keep the peace, how to prevent war, right? I mean, he's not stupid. I mean, I would respect his opinion on this, but, the same goes for most of you, right? We don't have any special expertise on diplomacy, how to keep the peace. Neither does Albert Einstein, no matter how smart he might be elsewhere, right? Another one, taking a soccer coach's word on what we should do about COVID, right? There's actually a great example of a soccer coach who was modest enough to avoid this guy Jurgen Klopp. They asked him and they expected him to hold forth, and he's basically like, I'm not an expert. Why are you asking me? I'm a soccer coach. Don't ask me. It's like, you guys aren't doing your job very well if you're asking a soccer coach about this. Ask me about soccer, right? If a soccer coach was to hold forth on what we should do about COVID, again, his opinion's just as valid as yours or mine, but he's not an expert, right? 3 is one that's I hate because I have to deal with it all the time. Bill Gates, the guy behind Microsoft Word, Outlook, and other programs. We can argue if Bill Gates is even an expert in the field he's in, but even if he is, he doesn't know exactly how to fix education in America. Trust me as a professor, every time Bill Gates has a dumb idea, I have to waste one of my days off and sit through some stupid seminar where we are just like harangued about Bill Gates' stupid idea from some 20-year-old, right? Bill Gates might be good at what he does. I don't know. I've always used Macs. I really hate Outlook. I don't think he is. But even if he is, he has no special expertise on education, right? That's not his field. Even somebody I think actually is probably good with designing programs that people might actually like to use, they don't know a whole lot about education especially, right? You want to talk about computers? We'll listen to Bill Gates. Want to talk about education? No reason his opinion should matter more than anybody else's. Leonardo DiCaprio and climate change. Right? I like Leonardo DiCaprio, right? I really liked some Leonardo DiCaprio movies. Um, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I saw it like last year. That was great. He's a great actor. I think he gets enough credit for it because he's pretty, right? But even giving him credit for being a great actor, there's no reason to think that Leonardo DiCaprio knows anything especially about climate change, right? Some examples of two. A doctor who says vaccines don't work, that's not the consensus among doctors, right? I forget his name, but there was an astronomer, you might have heard the universe was formed in the Big Bang. One of my astronomy professors, I forget this dude, his name, he denied the Big Bang until his dying day. He said the universe had always existed in its current state. This dude was an outlier, this dude was a kook. He was around forever. One of my astronomy professors used to complain about him all the time. Consensus in psychology these days is repressed memories are probably, for the most part, not real, right? Memory is very fallible. Memory is very malleable. Most repressed memories aren't actually, reliable. But you could probably still find a psychologist who believes in repressed memories. The consensus in the field these days is that, most probably aren't real. The ones, even if there might be a few odd real ones, they're not reliable. But you might find some psychologist who thinks, oh yeah, you can remember stuff that happened to you when you were 2, just with the proper therapy, right? That's not a common view in the field. The consensus is against it. Some examples of 3, right? Where there's no agreement in the field, right? If you're a conservative, you can find economists who say that the minimum wage will destroy jobs left and right. The problem with doing that is if you're a liberal, you can also find economists who say, no, it won't do that at all. It might even actually help jobs, right? Not saying one or the other is right, but there's controversy in the field. You can't cherry pick a person just to agree with you. On the liberal side, you can find economists who will say that we can spend without raising taxes, and it'll be fine. You can also find economists who say it'll be a disaster, so you can't just cherry pick this, the people who agree with you. You can find psychologists who believe implicit bias plays a major role in a lot of behaviors. Implicit bias, racism, sexism that we're not aware of. You can also find a lot of psychologists who doubt that research, right? Not saying one side is wrong or right. There is debate. It's wrong to cherry pick one person when there's not yet a consensus in the field. Finally, an education expert who believes in high stakes testing, that is, testing, in a lot of classes and deciding funding based on that. Some believe in it, some don't. You can't just cherry pick the person who agrees with it or doesn't. Anyway, hopefully you guys get an example. If you guys get an idea of like some illicit uses of, bad arguments from authority. Here's a final question. It's basically, answer this question is, as a sort of homework. Why are moral arguments from authority usually not acceptable? When we look at a moral argument from authority, somebody appeals to the Dalai Lama or the Pope or Mr. Rogers. Why? Which of these 3 conditions would those appeals to authority for settling moral claims fail? Think about that as a sort of homework. Answer it, next time.